Welcome to this journey of one of the most disturbing cases in recorded history of Louisiana. Before we begin, I invite you to leave a comment about where you're watching from and the exact time you heard this story. We're interested in knowing where and at what times of day or night these documented accounts arrive. The year was 1837 when Beaumont Plantation first appeared in the records of St. Francisville, Louisiana. What began as another opulent estate along the Mississippi River would eventually become the site of one of the most disturbing chapters in the region's history, one that would remain buried in private correspondence and fragmentary accounts until a historian's discovery in 1962. The plantation's legacy, unlike its grand architecture, was not meant to endure in public memory. Some stories, it seems, were deliberately obscured, hidden behind the manicured gardens and sweeping oak alleys that characterized the grand estates of the antebellum South. The parish records from this period describe the establishment of Beaumont as a significant addition to the agricultural prosperity of the region. The documents note the purchase of the initial 800 acres by Thomas Harrington in late 1836, followed by the acquisition of additional parcels over the next 3 years, eventually creating an estate encompassing nearly 1,500 acres of prime cotton-growing land. The construction of the main house began in early 1837 and was completed by the following year, an unusually rapid timeline that local accounts attributed to Harrington's considerable resources and determination. According to the parish records, Beaumont Plantation belonged to the Harrington family, wealthy cotton producers who had established themselves as pillars of Louisiana high society. Judge Thomas Harrington, the patriarch, was known for his ruthlessness in business and his iron hand at home. His vast estate employed over 200 enslaved individuals, and his reputation for severe discipline was whispered about throughout the parish. Local accounts describe him as a man of imposing physical presence, tall, broad-shouldered, with a voice that could silence a crowded courtroom without effort. His legal career had brought him considerable wealth, but it was the plantation that symbolized his status. A local newspaper article from 1839 described Judge Harrington as a gentleman of considerable legal acumen and business sense, whose judgment on the bench is matched only by his skill in agricultural enterprise. What the public accounts fail to mention, but what emerges from private correspondence, is the fear he inspired in both his family and the wider community. A letter from a neighboring plantation owner to his brother in Virginia mentions that Harrington's methods may produce results, but they inspire neither loyalty nor affection. One complies with his wishes out of necessity rather than respect. The judge had not been born to wealth, but had acquired it through a combination of legal skill, advantageous marriage, and ruthless business practices. The son of a modestly successful merchant in Virginia, he had studied law and built his early career in Richmond before relocating to Louisiana in the 1820s. His marriage to Carolyn Beaufort, daughter of a prominent Charleston family, provided both social connections and initial capital. By the time he established Beaumont Plantation, he had already made a name for himself as both a judge and an investor, with an uncanny ability to acquire distressed properties just before they increased in value. What makes this story particularly unsettling is not the cruelty that was commonplace on such plantations, but rather the psychological web of manipulation, obsession, and revenge that unfolded behind the grand white columns of the Harrington mansion. A story that comes to us through fragments, diary entries, correspondence between family members, sales receipts, and the testimony of a local physician whose records were discovered during the renovation of an old apothecary in Baton Rouge in 1958. These documents, yellowed with age and water damaged in places, offer glimpses into the complex power dynamics that existed within the Harrington household. The mansion itself was described in an architectural survey from 1845 as a magnificent example of Greek Revival design, featuring 6 imposing columns across the front facade, floor-to-ceiling windows, and a grand central hallway running the length of the house. Behind this impressive exterior, however, lay a household fraught with tension and unspoken conflicts. The survey notes that, unlike many similar estates, Beaumont featured unusually thick interior walls, ensuring privacy and discretion for the family and their affairs. This architectural detail would later prove significant in the unfolding of our story. The interior design choices at Beaumont also reflected the judge's personality and priorities. Where other plantation homes featured spaces designed for entertainment and socializing, Beaumont emphasized the judge's private study, an unusually large room positioned at the heart of the house, from which, as one visitor noted, one could monitor comings and goings throughout the main floor. The study featured a specially designed desk positioned to face the door, so that anyone entering would immediately fall under the judge's scrutiny. Judge Harrington's eldest son, Everett, was being groomed to take over the family business. By all accounts, Everett was educated in the finest schools of the North before returning to Louisiana to learn plantation management. The parish records describe him as a young gentleman of refined sensibilities and considerable intellectual achievement. However, personal correspondence between the judge and his brother in Virginia reveals tension between father and son over Everett's inappropriate sympathies and dangerous ideas brought back from his time in Massachusetts. In one particularly telling letter, the judge writes, "The boy returns to us changed. His manners are correct, his education evident, but there is something in his gaze now, a reluctance when certain matters of plantation discipline are discussed. This must be corrected if he is to maintain what we have built." Everett's education at Harvard had exposed him to abolitionist ideas that were gaining traction in New England during the 1830s. While the historical record doesn't suggest he had become an outright abolitionist, several sources indicate he had developed uncomfortable questions about the institution that formed the foundation of his family's wealth. A fellow Harvard student, in a memoir published decades later, recalled Everett as unusually contemplative for a Southern gentleman, frequently engaging in philosophical debates regarding natural rights and the moral implications of inherited systems of labor. The fellow student, James Whitcomb, wrote that Everett often found himself isolated among his Southern peers at Harvard who tended to avoid discussions that might challenge their inherited worldview. While never explicitly denouncing his family's way of life, Harrington displayed an intellectual curiosity and moral questioning that was unusual and somewhat suspect among the sons of plantation owners. Whitcomb further noted that Everett developed a particular interest in the writings of Emerson and Thoreau, often carrying their works with him and quoting them in conversation. Upon his return to Beaumont in early 1841, Everett found himself caught between two worlds: the intellectual environment of Cambridge, with its emerging humanitarian ideals, and the rigid social hierarchy of the plantation South. His father viewed this inner conflict as weakness, a dangerous liability, in a society where any questioning of established order could have significant consequences. In a letter to his brother, the judge confided, "Something must be done to anchor the boy firmly to our way of life. His mind wanders to dangerous territories. I fear what might become of him and us if this is not addressed decisively." The judge's concern was not merely philosophical, but practical. In the climate of the 1840s South, with increasing tension over slavery and growing pressure from Northern abolitionists, any perceived softness on the issue could damage a family's social and economic standing. The community of wealthy planters operated on mutual trust and shared values. Those who diverged too significantly from the consensus could find themselves isolated, their business opportunities limited, their families ostracized. For a man like Judge Harrington, who had built his position through careful cultivation of the right connections, his son's ideological wavering represented a potential threat to everything he had achieved. In the spring of 1841, a woman named Mercy arrived at Beaumont Plantation. Her arrival was documented in an inventory ledger simply as female, age approximately 22, weight considerable, purchased from Moreau Plantation, price below market. What makes this transaction unusual was both the reduced price and a cryptic note in the margin, special arrangement with H. Moreau, regarding troublesome property. The ledger entry includes a notation about her skills as a house servant, but makes special mention of her stubborn nature and requiring firm handling. This language, while common in such documents, takes on greater significance in light of what followed. The price paid for Mercy was indeed well below the usual market rate for an enslaved woman of her age and skills. Plantation records typically recorded such transactions in straightforward financial terms with little elaboration unless there were unusual circumstances affecting valuation. The discount, combined with the marginal notation, suggests that Harold Moreau was particularly motivated to transfer Mercy to another owner, a fact that becomes more understandable in light of what we learn from the Moreau Plantation records. Her weight was mentioned repeatedly in the overseer's logs, along with notations about food theft and insolence. According to a letter from Harold Moreau to Judge Harrington, she had become impossible to control and set a poor example for others. The letter further states that conventional discipline has proven ineffective and that Moreau was eager to be rid of the problem, even at considerable financial loss. What is particularly unusual about these records is the level of detail devoted to a single enslaved person. Records from the Moreau Plantation, which were partially preserved in the Louisiana State Archives, suggest that Mercy had been born on that property and had worked primarily in the kitchen. Plantation records typically dealt with individuals in a cursory manner, recording basic information related to productivity and health. The extensive documentation regarding Mercy suggests she had become a particular focus of attention or concern for the Moreau Plantation management. One entry notes that she had a manner of looking directly at you that unsettles the household staff, and that despite repeated correction, she maintains an air of dignity that is entirely inappropriate to her station. The Moreau Plantation records include an incident from December 1840 that seems to have precipitated the eventual sale. According to the overseer's log, Mercy had been accused of insubordination during preparations for the Christmas feast. The exact nature of this insubordination is not specified, but the consequences were severe. She was temporarily removed from kitchen duties and assigned to field work as punishment. The log notes that, rather than showing appropriate contrition, the subject maintained the same demeanor, creating discomfort among the field hands. After 3 weeks of this arrangement, Harold Moreau apparently decided that more drastic measures were required. A letter from Moreau's wife to her sister provides additional context. Harold has finally decided to sell the troublesome kitchen woman. Her attitude has become impossible, and I confess I am relieved. There is something in her gaze that has always disturbed me, as if she were making judgments rather than receiving orders. Harold believes Judge Harrington may have the firmness of character required to manage such a disposition. This letter, dated February 1841, suggests that the transfer to Beaumont was not merely a financial transaction, but a deliberate choice based on Judge Harrington's reputation for strict discipline. What happened next is where this story takes its most disturbing turn. According to household accounts kept by Mrs. Harrington, Judge Harrington assigned Mercy not to the fields or the kitchen, but to his son Everett as a personal house servant. A diary believed to belong to Mrs. Harrington's lady's maid contains a telling entry. The judge believes a test is needed. The young master must prove his resolve in maintaining proper order. The new woman is intentionally difficult. A lesson in management. This entry, dated April 18, 1841, provides a chilling insight into the judge's mindset. The assignment was not merely a practical matter of household organization, but a deliberate psychological test. The judge's plan appears to have been a form of psychological manipulation, assigning his son, an enslaved person who was considered troublesome, as a test of his authority and commitment to the plantation system he seemed to question. It was, in essence, a cruel experiment in power dynamics designed to harden his son to the realities of plantation ownership. By forcing Everett to exert control over another human being, particularly one who had already demonstrated resistance to such control, the judge hoped to eliminate his son's moral qualms about the system they benefited from. This psychological tactic represents a disturbing insight into how power was maintained and transmitted within the plantation system. Beyond the economic and physical aspects of slavery lay complex webs of psychological control, not just of the enslaved, but of the enslavers themselves. Family members, particularly the younger generation, had to be trained and tested in the art of domination, their natural empathy suppressed or redirected to maintain the system. The judge's experiment with Everett and Mercy represents this process in microcosm, a deliberate attempt to reshape his son's character through the exercise of power over another person. The household staff, according to several accounts, viewed this arrangement with trepidation. The head butler, whose reminiscences were recorded by a local historian in 1879, recalled that tension filled the house from the moment that woman arrived. The judge watched his son like a hawk, waiting for him to falter in authority. The young master seemed caught between his father's expectations and his own nature. It was like watching a storm gather over the river. You knew something terrible was coming, but could do nothing to stop it. Another account comes from a former kitchen worker interviewed in the 1870s who remembered the atmosphere during this period. Miss Mercy wasn't like the others. She carried herself different, spoke proper when she did speak, which wasn't often. The old master, the judge, he watched her like he was expecting something. And the young master, he seemed troubled by the whole business. Folks in the quarters would whisper about it, but quiet-like. Wasn't healthy to talk too much about what went on in the big house. Everett's own private journal, discovered behind a loose brick in what was once his study during renovations in 1962, reveals a man in profound conflict. His early entries show frustration and bewilderment at being assigned Mercy as his personal servant. He writes of arguments with his father about the arrangement and his discomfort with the situation. Father insists I must learn to command respect and obedience. He watches me like a hawk circling wounded prey, waiting for signs of weakness. Another entry, dated approximately 2 weeks after Mercy's arrival, states, I cannot sleep. Father's test weighs on me. Ly. Stand silently, awaiting orders I have no desire to give. When our eyes meet, I see not submission, but assessment. She is taking my measure as surely as I am taking hers. In a particularly revealing passage, Everett writes, Father believes this arrangement will strengthen my character, as he puts it. He sees my reluctance to command as weakness, my discomfort with our system as a moral failing to be corrected. What he fails to understand is that my questions arise not from weakness, but from thought. I have seen other ways of organizing society during my time in the North. I have read the arguments, considered the moral implications. His response is not to engage with these ideas, but to force me into deeper complicity with the system I question. It is a crude form of persuasion, yet I find myself with little choice but to participate, at least outwardly. The pressure on Everett was immense. His journal entries describe meals where his father would quiz him about Mercy's performance, demanding to know if she had been properly managed and whether any correction had been necessary. Today at dinner, Father asked pointedly if M had completed her duties satisfactorily. When I indicated she had, he seemed disappointed. Later, he suggested I was being too lenient. Satisfactory obedience is not enough, he said. They must fear the consequences of anything less than perfection. I excused myself before dessert, claiming a headache. It was not entirely a falsehood. The psychological warfare being waged at the dinner table extended beyond these conversations. Everett's journal describes how his father would sometimes summon Mercy to serve at meals, specifically so he could observe the interactions between her and his son. Father called for M to serve the wine tonight, though this is normally James's duty. He watched every movement, every glance between us. His eyes missed nothing. After she withdrew, he commented that she carried herself with unusual pride for one in her position, and asked what measures I had taken to correct this. When I said I saw no problem with her service, his expression darkened. "Perhaps you need a demonstration," he said. The threat in his voice was unmistakable. The household accounts from this period show increasing tension within the Harrington family. The judge's wife hosted fewer social gatherings. Entries in account books show increased purchases of brandy and whiskey. A letter from Mrs. Harrington to her sister in Charleston mentions unbearable tension and the judge's determination to break his son's spirit as he would break a wild horse. She describes meals where hardly a word is spoken that is not charged with unspoken conflict, and notes that she has taken to having trays sent to my room to avoid the battlefield our dining table has become. The strain affected the household routine in visible ways. The frequency of formal dinners declined significantly, with the judge often taking meals in his study. Mrs. Harrington's personal expenses showed an increase in purchases from the local apothecary, laudanum, and other preparations that would have helped manage anxiety and sleeplessness. The staff, according to later accounts, walked on eggshells, aware of the tension but uncertain of its specific cause. The butler recalled that the judge became more particular about everything during this time. The slightest imperfection in service would provoke his anger. It was as if he needed to control every aspect of his domain with absolute precision. Mrs. Harrington, born Carolyn Beaufort, of the prominent Charleston Beauforts, had always maintained a certain distance from the day-to-day operations of the plantation. Her correspondence reveals a woman who found refuge in literature, music, and correspondence with her extended family. Unlike many plantation mistresses who took an active role in household management, she delegated extensively to the head housekeeper and rarely involved herself in matters concerning the enslaved workers. Her diary entries from this period suggest a growing concern about her husband's obsession with their son's development. Thomas speaks of nothing else. His determination to mold Everett into his own image has become something dark and frightening. I fear what this fixation may do to all of us. Caroline's position in this household drama was complicated by her upbringing and the expectations of her social class. As a woman from a prominent Southern family, she had been raised to support her husband's authority and maintain family harmony above all else. Her diary entries reveal her inner conflict, concern for her son's well-being, balanced against her ingrained deference to her husband's decisions. "I find myself in an impossible position," she writes. "To support Thomas is to watch Everett suffer under this education he has devised. To support Everett would mean defying my husband openly, something no wife in our society can do without consequences. I am reduced to small kindnesses offered in private and prayers that this obsession will pass." As weeks turned into months, something unexpected began to develop. Everett's journal entries shifted in tone. What began as entries filled with frustration gradually transformed into something more complex. He began to refer to conversations with Mercy, initially recording them as evidence of her insolence, but later recounting her intelligence, her observations, and eventually her humor. The transformation is subtle at first, a noted surprise at an insightful comment, an admission of being caught off guard by her knowledge of literature he had carelessly left visible in his study. An entry from October 1841 reads, "Mem mentioned today that the mockingbirds near her window seemed to mimic the rhythm of my father's walking cane on the floorboards. She notices everything. She sees this house more clearly than those who built it." Another, a week later, found M looking at my copy of Emerson. When I asked if she could read, She did not answer directly, but commented on the passage that was marked, as if she knew precisely what had drawn my attention. Later, I realized she had subtly corrected my interpretation of the text. I did not acknowledge this aloud. By November, his entries began to show a growing awareness of the complexities of their situation. I find myself in the absurd position of pretending to master someone who sees through the pretense entirely. We maintain the required formalities when others are present, but alone, something else has developed. Not friendship exactly, for how can there be true friendship where such inequality exists? Yet there is understanding, and in understanding, a kind of freedom neither of us can acknowledge openly. By December, his entries became more personal. Today, Obese described the stars as she learned them from her grandmother. Names I've never heard in any astronomy text. There is wisdom here that Harvard never taught me. The increasing warmth and respect in these entries is unmistakable, though Everett still maintains a certain formality, rarely referring to Mercy by her full name, and often catching himself when his admiration becomes too evident. In a particularly revealing entry from late December, Everett writes, "I realize with some alarm that I look forward to our conversations more than any other part of my day. When M speaks of her childhood memories or shares her observations about the household, I glimpse a mind that, given different circumstances, might have flourished in ways mine has been privileged to do. There is an injustice here that goes beyond the general evil of our system, the waste of potential, the deliberate suppression of intelligence and spirit. I find myself questioning not just slavery itself, but the entire edifice of assumptions upon which our society is built. It appears that the judge's psychological experiment was producing results entirely opposite to those intended. Rather than hardening his son through the exercise of power, the arrangement was fostering a growing recognition of Mercy's humanity, precisely the outcome the judge had sought to prevent. A particularly revealing entry from late December reads, "Father asked again today if M requires more stern management. I assured him all was well." His eyes narrowed. "You seem remarkably tolerant of her shortcomings," he said. "Perhaps you need a demonstration of proper authority." I felt cold at his words, must find ways to shield M from his attention. This entry suggests that the judge was becoming aware that his plan was not having the desired effect. Rather than embracing his role as master, Everett was developing a relationship with Mercy that transgressed the rigid boundaries of the plantation hierarchy. The judge's threat of a demonstration carried ominous implications, suggesting he might intervene directly to reassert the proper power dynamic, a prospect that clearly alarmed Everett. The plantation physician's records, kept in meticulous ledgers discovered decades later, note a curious development during this time. Entries concerning Mercy, initially focused on her weight and recommending dietary restrictions, began to mention improvements in her health. More telling, perhaps, are entries concerning Everett, noting nervousness, irregular sleep, and loss of appetite. The doctor prescribed tonics and recommended outdoor activity and less intellectual stimulation. In January 1842, the doctor writes, "Young Mr. Harrington continues to exhibit signs of nervous agitation. When questioned about his sleeping habits, he becomes evasive. Have suggested to the judge that perhaps a change of duties for the young man might be beneficial." The judge dismissed this advice in strong terms. The physician's records provide a clinical perspective on the psychological drama unfolding at Beaumont. Dr. William Summers, who attended to several prominent families in St. Francisville, maintained detailed notes on his patients' conditions and treatments. His observations of Everett's declining physical health mirror the emotional turmoil evident in the young man's journal. The doctor notes that Everett has lost significant weight since my previous examination and displays signs of chronic sleep deprivation, including trembling hands and difficulty concentrating during conversation. These symptoms, viewed alongside Everett's private writings, paint a picture of someone under intense psychological strain. The winter of 1841-1842 brought unusually cold weather to Louisiana. Household accounts show increased expenditures for firewood and blankets. A letter from Judge Harrington to his cotton broker mentions domestic concerns taking precedence over business matters. His wife's correspondence to relatives became less frequent, and when letters were sent, they were noticeably brief and devoid of family news. The plantation seemed to be turning inward, isolating itself from the usual social interactions that characterized plantation society. This isolation did not go unnoticed in the community. The local parish records note that the Harringtons were conspicuously absent from the Christmas service in 1841, an unusual occurrence for a family of their standing. A neighboring plantation owner, in a letter to his son in New Orleans, mentioned that Harrington has become increasingly reclusive. An invitation to join a hunting party was declined without explanation. The few who have visited Beaumont in recent weeks report a household under strain. Mrs. H. appears pale and withdrawn, while the judge dominates all conversation, particularly when his son is present. The winter months intensified the claustrophobic atmosphere at Beaumont. With outdoor activities curtailed by the weather, the family was confined more closely together within the mansion's walls. Everett's journal entries from January 1842 reflect this increased pressure. The house feels like a trap closing around us. Father watches constantly. Mother retreats into silence. And M. I fear for her most of all. Something in Father's manner when he looks at her chills my blood. He suspects, though what precisely he suspects, I am not certain. But I know the consequences would fall most heavily on her. In February 1842, something happened that changed everything at Beaumont Plantation. The exact details remain unclear, but multiple sources suggest a confrontation between Judge Harrington and his son. The household accounts show a sudden dismissal of two house servants who had been with the family for years. The plantation overseer's log contains a cryptic entry: "Young master confined to quarters by judge's orders. No visitors permitted." A local merchant's account book notes a large order placed by the judge for new locks and additional window bars to be installed immediately. The precipitating incident is hinted at in a letter from Mrs. Harrington to her sister, though in deliberately vague terms. A situation of the most distressing nature has developed. Thomas discovered something that has thrown him into a state of rage unlike anything I have witnessed in our 20 years of marriage. Everett is effectively a prisoner in his own room. I am permitted to bring him meals, but our conversations are limited and must remain general in nature. Thomas has forbidden any mention of the matter and insists it will be resolved by whatever means necessary. I fear for my son's safety and state of mind. Everett's journal entries from this period are frantic and disjointed. Father knows or suspects. The walls have ears. Cannot trust anyone. Must protect M at all costs. Later entries become even more alarming. Father threatens to sell her West. Says he will break this madness out of me once and for all. The West referred to here would have been the notorious plantations of Mississippi, Alabama, or even further west, where conditions were often harsher and the work more brutal than on the longer-established Louisiana plantations. One particularly disturbing entry reads, "Father came to my room last night, brandy on his breath. Said he had been blind, but now sees clearly. Said no son of his would dishonor the family by developing unnatural attachments. His words, I bought her to test your mastery, not to witness your degradation. He has given me 3 days to recover my senses before he takes matters into his own hands." The exact nature of what the judge discovered is never explicitly stated in any of the surviving documents. Given the social and moral codes of the time, the deliberate vagueness is unsurprising. Some matters were considered too sensitive to commit to paper, even in private correspondence. What is clear from the reactions is that whatever connection had developed between Everett and Mercy had crossed the boundaries of what was considered acceptable, even within the already morally compromised context of plantation society. The 3 days mentioned in Everett's journal appear to have been a period of intense activity and planning. The entries become shorter, more cryptic, often just fragmentary notes. Spoke with Samuel about river schedules, must move quickly. And later, money secured, route planned, 2 days at most. These suggest that Everett was rapidly developing an escape plan, though the practical challenges would have been enormous. As the son of a prominent judge, his disappearance would be quickly noticed and pursued. The legal and social consequences for both him and Mercy would be severe if they were caught. The St. Francisville Parish Registry contains a curious entry dated March 4, 1842. It records the manumission of female slave named Mercy, property of Judge Thomas Harrington, with the notation, "Freedom purchased by anonymous benefactor." This was an extremely unusual occurrence, particularly given the climate in Louisiana at that time, when laws regarding manumission were becoming increasingly restrictive. The document bears the signature of a local magistrate, who was known to be an associate of the judge, suggesting that whatever arrangement was made had been handled quietly through personal connections. What makes this document particularly intriguing is the source of the funds for this manumission. Parish records indicate that just 1 week earlier, Everett Harrington had sold a valuable piece of property he had inherited from his maternal grandfather. The timing strongly suggests that he used these funds to secure Mercy's freedom, a desperate measure to protect her from his father's threats. The legal process of manumission was complex and increasingly difficult in 1840s Louisiana. State laws required multiple witnesses, court appearances, and often proof that the enslaved person had provided extraordinary service justifying their freedom. The process could take months under normal circumstances. The speed with which Mercy's manumission was processed suggests extraordinary influence was exerted, possibly financial inducements to the officials involved. Even more unusually, there is no record of the customary bond that freed people were required to post as security for their good behavior, nor of the character witnesses normally required to testify to their worthiness for freedom. What happened next is pieced together from multiple fragmentary sources. Judge Harrington's business correspondence shows a man increasingly distracted from his affairs. His letters became shorter, more irritable, and often focused on his son's defiance. In one letter to his lawyer he writes, "The boy must be made to understand the natural order of things. His behavior threatens everything we have built." Another letter to a business associate in New Orleans contains a disturbing passage. "Family matters have required my full attention. A situation involving my son has necessitated firm intervention. I trust the matter will be resolved shortly, though the cost may be higher than anticipated." The judge's correspondence reveals a man struggling to maintain control over a situation that threatened both his family authority and potentially his social standing. In plantation society, family honor and public reputation were inextricably linked to economic prosperity. Any scandal or suggestion of impropriety could have ripple effects beyond the personal sphere, affecting business relationships and social connections. The judge's determination to resolve the situation can be understood not just as a father's authority being challenged, but as a businessman protecting his investments and social capital. A letter discovered in the collection of a New Orleans merchant family suggests that Everett was sent to their home in disgrace, ostensibly to learn the cotton export business, but actually as a form of exile from Beaumont. Judge Harrington's instructions to his hosts were explicit. The boy is to have no unsupervised time. No letters are to be sent or received without my review. This is a matter of family honor. The merchant's private journal expresses discomfort with the arrangement. Harrington asks me to play jailer to his son, though he phrases it as mentorship. The young man arrived today, sullen and withdrawn. I have placed him in the east bedroom, where the staff can monitor his movements. I dislike this business intensely, but Harrington holds notes on my business that I cannot afford to have called in. This arrangement, essentially a form of house arrest disguised as a business apprenticeship, represented the judge's attempt to physically separate Everett and Mercy while he determined a more permanent solution. The choice of New Orleans is significant. The city was large enough that Everett would be anonymous there, unable to draw on local connections for assistance, yet close enough that the judge could maintain supervision through his business associate. The financial leverage the judge held over the merchant ensured compliance with his unusual demands. Parish records show that in April 1842, Judge Harrington reported a theft of money and valuables from his home. The accused was a former slave woman who had recently gained her freedom. A warrant was issued, but there is no record of an arrest. Instead, there is a disturbing note in the sheriff's logbook: "Judge withdraws complaint. Matter to be handled privately." This ominous entry suggests that the judge may have intended to pursue Mercy through extra-legal means, perhaps employing slave catchers or other agents not bound by official procedures. The accusation of theft was a common tactic used against freed people, particularly when their former owners sought to regain control over them. Such charges were difficult to disprove and could result in re-enslavement as punishment. The withdrawal of the formal complaint, coupled with a notation about private handling, suggests the judge may have been attempting to avoid public scrutiny while still pursuing Mercy. It also indicates that she had likely fled the area, making official channels less useful than private agents, who could operate across jurisdictional boundaries. The physician's records from May 1842 include treatment for Judge Harrington following what is described as an episode of extreme agitation resulting in collapse. The doctor prescribed bed rest and sedatives, noting that the judge was fixated on matters of family honor and betrayal. The doctor's notes include a concerning observation: "Patient exhibits dangerous fixation on son's perceived betrayal and the woman he believes responsible. Have recommended continued sedation and suggested that Mrs. H. remove all firearms from the premises as a precaution." This medical episode marks a turning point in the judge's ability to control the situation. His physical collapse, likely a stress-induced cardiac event or possibly a minor stroke, temporarily limited his capacity to pursue either Everett or Mercy. The doctor's concern about firearms suggests he recognized the potential for violence in the judge's state of mind, a professional assessment that the situation had escalated beyond normal family discord to something potentially dangerous. Everett's presence in New Orleans is confirmed by the merchant family's guest ledger, but entries abruptly end in early June. A letter from the merchant to Judge Harrington expresses concern that Everett had departed without notice, leaving his belongings behind. The merchant apologizes for failing to maintain proper supervision, adding he received no visitors nor any correspondence during his stay. His departure was discovered only when he failed to appear for breakfast. The back gate was found unlocked, suggesting he left sometime during the night. I have made discreet inquiries at the docks and stagecoaches, but without result. The timing of Everett's escape from New Orleans coincides with increased steamboat traffic along the Mississippi as the spring trade season was in full swing. Passenger manifests from this period are incomplete, but it would have been relatively easy for someone with financial resources to secure passage northward without attracting attention. The river connected the Deep South to the free states of the North, making it both a commercial artery and an escape route for those fleeing bondage, or in Everett's case, the bondage of family expectations. This sudden disappearance set off a flurry of correspondence between Judge Harrington and various contacts throughout Louisiana and neighboring states. Letters to business associates, law enforcement officials, and even former college classmates of Everett's all contain the same urgent request for information about his son's whereabouts. The judge's language grows increasingly desperate, and several recipients noted their concern about his mental state. A letter from one business associate in Natchez delicately suggests that the judge's pursuit might be counterproductive. "My dear Harrington, while I understand your distress, perhaps allowing the young man some time to reflect might yield better results than this vigorous pursuit. Sons often rebel before accepting their responsibilities. A period of hardship away from family comforts may accomplish what direct confrontation could not. The judge's response, preserved as a draft, is curt. You do not understand the full circumstances. This is not mere youthful rebellion, but something far more serious. The next documented evidence comes from an unexpected source, a small newspaper in Cincinnati, Ohio. A brief notice dated July 1842 announces the marriage of Everett Harrington, formerly of Louisiana, to a woman named Mary Johnson. No family is mentioned as being in attendance. This innocuous announcement, which would have gone unnoticed by most readers, represents a bombshell in our narrative. It strongly suggests that Everett and Mercy had not only escaped Louisiana together, but had married in a free state, with Mercy adopting a new identity. Cincinnati in the 1840s was known as a key stop on the Underground Railroad and home to a significant free black community. It was also a city where a mixed-race couple might find, if not acceptance, at least less overt hostility than in many other places. The choice of this location was likely deliberate, providing both geographical and cultural distance from the Louisiana Plantation Society. The newspaper notice is striking in its ordinariness, a simple announcement of a marriage indistinguishable from dozens of others on the same page. This very mundanity serves as camouflage, allowing Everett and Mercy to establish their new identity with the veneer of normalcy. The name change from Mercy to Mary Johnson would have provided additional protection, making it more difficult for anyone searching for them to make the connection. The decision to publicly announce their marriage, rather than keeping it entirely private, suggests a desire to establish themselves openly in their new community, albeit with altered identities. Back at Beaumont Plantation, the consequences were severe. Judge Harrington's health declined rapidly. Mrs. Harrington's diary entries from this period reveal a household in disarray. Thomas speaks of nothing but disgrace. He has burned E.'s letters unopened. He has forbidden his name to be spoken in this house. She describes her husband as a man consumed by rage that has nowhere to go, and notes that he has taken to pacing the hallways at night, sometimes stopping outside E.'s empty room for hours, as if willing him to materialize. The judge's deterioration is further documented in the physician's records. Dr. Summers notes increasingly frequent visits to treat nervous exhaustion, disrupted sleep, and episodes of rage, followed by profound melancholy. The prescription of laudanum and other sedatives increases, suggesting the doctor was struggling to manage the judge's emotional volatility. By late summer, the records indicate that the judge had begun to experience physical symptoms, including tremors in the hands and occasional difficulty forming words, possible early signs of the stroke that would eventually claim his life. The family's social standing began to suffer as rumors circulated through St. Francisville society. Invitations decreased, and those that did arrive were frequently declined by the judge, who cited ill health. Mrs. Harrington's correspondence with her sister reveals her isolation. "We have become virtual prisoners in our own home. Thomas suspects everyone of gossiping about the family disgrace. Perhaps they are. I find I no longer care what they say. The silence in this house is suffocating." This social isolation represented a significant fall from grace for a family that had once been at the center of local society. Plantation culture relied heavily on visiting, entertaining, and participation in community events to maintain status and connections. The Harringtons' withdrawal would have been noted and discussed, generating speculation that could potentially damage their standing further. Mrs. Harrington's letter suggests she had reached a point of emotional exhaustion where even this social death had ceased to concern her, a stark contrast to her previous careful maintenance of the family's position. In August 1842, a letter arrived at Beaumont from a law firm in Boston. According to Mrs. Harrington's diary, this letter sent the judge into a rage. Though the contents of the letter were never explicitly recorded, Subsequent entries suggest that Everett had secured a position teaching at a small school in Massachusetts and had written to formally renounce his inheritance. Mrs. Harrington writes, "T destroyed the letter after reading it, tearing it to pieces and throwing it into the fire. He then locked himself in his study with a bottle of brandy. The sounds that emerged, half sobbing, half roaring, were so disturbing that I was forced to retire to my room with a headache powder." The formal renunciation of inheritance represented the final severing of ties between Everett and his father. By rejecting his claim to the family wealth, Everett was symbolically rejecting everything the judge had built and stood for. In a society where family legacy and the transmission of wealth were paramount, this act would have been seen as the ultimate repudiation. For the judge who had dedicated his life to building a dynasty, this rejection by his heir would have been devastating on both practical and emotional levels. The doctor's records show increasingly frequent visits to Beaumont throughout the fall of 1842. The judge's condition deteriorated, with symptoms including paralysis of the left side, difficulty speaking, and periods of extreme agitation. The doctor's notes mention that the mere mention of his son's name would trigger these episodes. By November, the judge was largely confined to his bedroom, attended by his wife and a rotating staff of servants, many of whom requested reassignment due to his unpredictable temper and verbal abuse. Dr. Summers' records from this period provide a clinical progression of the judge's decline. Initial symptoms of stress and emotional disturbance give way to more serious physical manifestations. The doctor notes increasing difficulty with fine motor control, slurring of speech particularly when agitated, and episodes of confusion. Modern medical knowledge would recognize these as warning signs of impending cerebrovascular events. The doctor, working with the limited medical understanding of the time, prescribed various tonics and sedatives while recommending rest and the avoidance of exciting topics, a prescription that proved impossible to follow given the judge's obsession with his son's betrayal. On December 18, 1842, Judge Thomas Harrington died. The official cause listed in parish records was apoplexy, what we would now recognize as a stroke. Mrs. Harrington's final diary entry regarding the matter is chilling in its brevity. Thomas is gone. His pride killed him as surely as any disease. The local newspaper published a lengthy obituary praising the judge's contributions to the community, his legal acumen, and his business success. No mention was made of family discord or his estranged son. The funeral, according to church records, was well attended by local dignitaries and business associates, a public show of respect that contrasted with the private reality of the judge's isolated final months. With the judge's death, the atmosphere at Beaumont changed. Household accounts show Mrs. Harrington gradually resuming social activities and making changes to the estate management. Several of the more harsh overseers were replaced, and conditions for the enslaved workers reportedly improved somewhat, though the fundamental injustice of their situation remained unchanged. Mrs. Harrington, however, could not change the economic reality of the plantation, which began to struggle without the judge's business acumen. Account books from this period show declining profits and increasing debt. Cotton prices had fallen, and without the judge's network of business connections, the plantation found itself at a disadvantage. Mrs. Harrington's correspondence indicates she was forced to sell several parcels of land to maintain operations. A letter to her brother in Charleston acknowledges her limited knowledge of plantation management. I find myself adrift in a sea of financial complexity for which nothing in my education prepared me. The overseer presents accounts I struggle to comprehend. I suspect some advantage is being taken, but have no way to prove it. The years following the judge's death represent a period of gradual decline for Beaumont Plantation. Mrs. Harrington maintained the property as best she could, but without her husband's business skills or her son's presence, the estate never regained its former prosperity. Local records show decreasing production, sales of outlying land parcels, and a reduction in the number of enslaved workers as financial pressures forced difficult decisions. What had once been one of the region's showcase plantations became a diminished version of itself, still impressive in appearance, but increasingly hollow behind its grand facade. The story might have ended there, buried in family shame and forgotten correspondence, if not for what happened 16 years later. In 1858, Mrs. Harrington, now elderly and the sole occupant of Beaumont, aside from a small staff, received a letter from Boston. According to her companion's account, she read the letter in private, and then did something unexpected. She ordered the carriage prepared for a journey. The companion wrote in her journal, "Mrs. H. received correspondence today that caused quite a transformation. She has been more animated than I have seen her in years, giving orders for her best clothes to be packed, and arrangements made for an extended absence. When I inquired about our destination, she merely smiled and said, 'To meet family, my dear, after too long a separation.'" This sudden decision to travel, particularly for an elderly woman in declining health, indicates the profound importance of the letter's contents. Mrs. Harrington had maintained Beaumont for 16 years following her husband's death, rarely traveling beyond St. Francisville. The decision to undertake a journey to Boston, a distance of over 1,000 miles and a journey of several weeks, by the transportation of the time, suggests an emotional urgency that overrode practical concerns. Parish records show that in November 1858, Mrs. Harrington revised her will. The new document included a surprising provision, a bequest to Mary Harrington of Boston, in recognition of family bonds too long denied. This was followed by instructions for specific family heirlooms to be sent north. Among the items listed were several pieces of jewelry that had been in the Beaufort family for generations, a clear indication that Mrs. Harrington had come to accept her daughter-in-law despite the circumstances. The will also included specific instructions regarding Beaumont Plantation itself. Rather than attempting to keep the estate intact, Mrs. Harrington directed that it be sold upon her death, with the proceeds divided among specified beneficiaries. This decision represented a final break with the judge's vision of a dynastic family seat passing through generations. Mrs. Harrington had apparently concluded that Beaumont's legacy was too tainted by the past to be worth preserving. Better to convert its value to financial assets that could support her son's family and other beneficiaries she deemed worthy. Mrs. Harrington departed Beaumont in early December 1858. Ship passenger manifests show she boarded a vessel bound for New York, accompanied only by her lady's maid. According to the companion's later account, given to a local historian in 1879, Mrs. Harrington intended to make peace before death claimed her as it had claimed her husband. The journey north in winter was a significant undertaking for an elderly woman in the 19th century, indicating the importance she placed on this reconciliation. The timing of this journey is significant in broader historical context as well. By late 1858, tensions between North and South were escalating toward what would eventually become the Civil War. Travel between the regions was becoming increasingly charged with political significance. Mrs. Harrington's journey represents a personal crossing of the hardening boundary between two increasingly hostile societies, a mother's determination to reconnect with her son overriding the societal pressures that would have discouraged such contact. What transpired in Boston remains largely unknown. No correspondence survives from this period. The only evidence of the visit comes from a Boston Society column noting the arrival of Mrs. Thomas Harrington of Louisiana visiting her son's family after a separation of many years. The column mentions that the family resided in a modest but respectable home near the university, where Mr. Harrington has established himself as an educator of some regard. This brief mention gives us a glimpse into the life Everett and Mercy Mary had built for themselves, far from the wealth and privilege of Beaumont Plantation, but apparently stable and respectable within their community. The reference to near the university likely places their home in Cambridge, possibly in the vicinity of Harvard, where Everett had studied. This choice of location would have provided them with a community more likely to be tolerant of their unusual situation. The description of Everett as an educator of some regard suggests he had found a way to use his Harvard education productively, though certainly with less financial reward than plantation ownership would have provided. Mrs. Harrington returned to Louisiana in February 1859. Her health, already fragile before the journey, deteriorated rapidly. According to her companion, she spent her final month sorting through family papers, burning many, but preserving others in a locked chest, with instructions that it not be opened until 50 years after her death. The companion recalled, she approached this task with great deliberation, reading each document carefully before consigning it either to the flames or to the chest. When I inquired about this process, she replied, "Some stories deserve to be forgotten. Others must be preserved, but only when the world is ready to understand them properly." This careful curation of family documents represents Mrs. Harrington's attempt to control the narrative that would survive her, to determine which aspects of the family history would be remembered and which forgotten. The decision to preserve some papers with a 50-year seal suggests she believed certain truths were important, but perhaps too controversial for contemporary society. She was, in effect, attempting to speak to a future she hoped would be more receptive to the full complexity of her family's story. She died in May 1859. Parish records show that Beaumont Plantation was sold shortly thereafter, the proceeds divided according to her revised will, with substantial portions going to her son's family in Boston. The plantation itself passed through several owners in the years leading up to the Civil War, and like many such properties, never regained its antebellum prosperity after the conflict. By the 1870s, the once grand estate had been subdivided, the mansion fallen into disrepair, its history fading into local legend, rather than lived memory. The locked chest and its contents disappeared during the Civil War when Beaumont was briefly occupied by Union troops. It wasn't until 1962, during the renovation of a small library in Baton Rouge, that a collection of papers was discovered sealed in a wall cavity. Among them were fragments of Everett's journal, correspondence between family members, and, most significantly, several letters between Everett and Mercy after their escape to the north. The discovery was made by construction workers who initially thought they had found an ordinary structural cavity. When they broke through the wall, they discovered a metal box that had been carefully sealed and placed within the wall during the library's original construction in the 1880s. How the documents made their way from Mrs. Harrington's chest to this hiding place remains a mystery. The librarian who first examined the contents recognized their historical significance and transferred them to the Louisiana State Archives, where they were cataloged and preserved. These letters reveal the final piece of this dark psychological puzzle. Mary Johnson, the woman Everett married in Cincinnati, was Mercy. After securing her legal freedom, they had fled north together, changing her name to distance her from her past. Their letters speak of constant fear of discovery, of the psychological toll of looking over their shoulders, and ultimately, of building a life together in a community where their unusual relationship might be tolerated, if not fully accepted. In one letter dated August 1842, Everett writes, "We must remain vigilant. Father has connections throughout the South and may yet pursue us. I wake at every sound in the night, fearing it might be someone he has sent." Mercy Mary's response counsels caution, but also determination. We cannot live in fear forever. Each day we build a new life is a victory against those who would deny us the right to choose our own path. You were willing to sacrifice everything for me. Now we must make that sacrifice meaningful by creating something worth the cost. The psychological aftermath of their escape is evident in these early letters. Both Everett and Mercy Mary describe symptoms consistent with what modern psychology would recognize as post-traumatic stress, hypervigilance, intrusive thoughts, difficulty sleeping, and persistent anxiety. Yet alongside these struggles, their correspondence reveals a determination to build something positive from their ordeal. Mercy Mary writes in one letter, "Sometimes I find myself startled by ordinary kindness from strangers. After so many years of expecting cruelty, simple human decency can bring me to tears. I am learning slowly to live as a person rather than property. You cannot imagine what this means." Later letters suggest that the couple found a community of like-minded individuals in Boston, including abolitionists and educational reformers. Everett secured a position teaching classics and mathematics at a small private academy, while Mary established herself as a seamstress. A particularly poignant letter from 1850 discusses the impact of the Fugitive Slave Act on their life. "The new law has cast a pall over our community. Several families we know have already fled to Canada. We debate whether to follow, but leaving the life we have built here would be another kind of defeat. Still, I keep a bag packed for us, ready at a moment's notice should the need arise." This reference highlights the precarious nature of their situation, even after years in the North. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 dramatically increased the danger for formerly enslaved people, eliminating many of the legal protections that free states had previously provided and empowering slave catchers to pursue their quarry across state lines. The letters also reveal how Everett and Mercy Mary navigated the complexities of their relationship within Northern society. While interracial marriages were legal in Massachusetts, they were still socially controversial. Everett writes in one letter to his mother, "We have found a small circle of friends who accept us as we are. Beyond that, we maintain a certain privacy. Mary is assumed by many to be of Spanish or Portuguese descent, an assumption we neither confirm nor deny. It is not perfect freedom, but it is far more than we could have hoped for in Louisiana." The last document in the collection is perhaps the most poignant, a letter from Mercy Mary to Mrs. Harrington following her visit to Boston. In it, she writes not as a former enslaved person, but as a daughter-in-law. "I cannot forget what was done to me at Beaumont. Those wounds do not heal entirely. But I have also come to understand that you too were trapped in your way. Your journey to us, at your age and in your health, speaks to your desire for reconciliation. For our own sake, I am willing to acknowledge this new beginning between us." This remarkable letter, crossing boundaries of race, class, and the traumatic history between the writer and recipient, speaks to the complexity of human relationships even within the most oppressive systems. Mercy Mary's willingness to acknowledge Mrs. Harrington's own limited agency within plantation society while still maintaining the truth of her own trauma represents an extraordinary emotional and intellectual nuance. The story of Beaumont Plantation and its inhabitants faded from memory as the Civil War and its aftermath transformed the region. The property changed hands multiple times, eventually being subdivided and developed. Today, nothing remains of the original structures. The land where the grand house once stood is now part of an industrial complex, the history of the site unknown to most who pass by it daily. The historian who discovered the hidden papers in 1962 attempted to trace the descendants of Everett and Mercy Mary Harrington, but found that the family had disappeared from Boston records after 1871. There was some evidence suggesting they may have relocated to Canada, perhaps still fleeing the shadow of their past, but the trail goes cold. A brief note in a Toronto church registry mentions a donation from E. and M. Harrington in 1872, but no further records have been located. What remains is this fragmentary account of psychological manipulation that backfired in the most unexpected way. A father's attempt to harden his son into a slave owner, resulting instead in a profound connection that defied the social order of the time. It's a reminder that even in the darkest chapters of human history, unexpected bonds could form, though often at terrible cost. The judge's plan to use mercy as a tool to correct his son's thinking represents a particularly insidious form of psychological cruelty, one that objectified her not just as property, but as an instrument of his will. That this plan failed so spectacularly speaks to the resilience of human connection in the face of systems designed to prevent it. Everett and Mercy's story serves as a counter-narrative to the prevailing assumptions of their time, a reminder that the boundaries erected between people are often more fragile than those who build them would like to believe. What psychological forces drove the judge to such extremes? His letters suggest a man who saw his son's moral qualms not just as weakness, but as a direct threat to the social order that privileged him. For men like Thomas Harrington, the plantation system wasn't merely an economic arrangement, but the foundation of their identity and worldview. Any questioning of it, particularly from within his own family, represented an existential threat that had to be neutralized at any cost. As we conclude this journey through one of history's stranger footnotes, consider the walls around you, the secrets they might hold, and the stories that power and privilege have tried to erase. For as Judge Harrington discovered too late, control is often an illusion, and the human heart may be the one thing that cannot be owned, no matter how much power one possesses.